being a historian and not an archaeologist, and not also an anthropologist, I thought that I should try to present here a general view, a general survey of the historical development of the more visible parts of our heritage, that is to say, buildings and related to it, sculpture. In other words, architecture and sculpture. Commonly, I see that in your program there is also reference to non-human heritage, but generally this is how national heritage is understood. Of course, one has to bear in mind that past scientific effort, past literature, past painting, all are parts of national heritage. I should like only to make the point that bad things are also part of national heritage, which we regard today as bad. National heritage is not public relations. A study of it demands that we should know what actually happened. And if there are defects or lack of, when we compare with other countries, lack of development, we should note it. Another important aspect is that in history of Eurasia in particular, and that includes to my mind North Africa and Central Africa, there have been continuous cases where important inventions, important traditions of construction, for instance, of painting, of sculpture, have passed from one country to another. Some countries have been pioneers, others have been receivers. And therefore, it is very important that this should also be remembered. And for India, as for any other country, whether it's China or Egypt or any other, one must also remember what other countries and peoples have contributed to our national heritage, good or bad, as I said. Unfortunately, in India, this kind of objective attitude is being increasingly endangered by claims that we did not owe anything to any other country. Indo-European languages didn't come from outside. We invented Indo-European languages and gave them to the world. Given an important award by the government, the present government, said that we made bronze statues, or Indians made, because he is himself an American, bronze statues in 5000 BC, when actually not even copper was known in India. And he claimed that it had been analyzed in Switzerland, but he never named the laboratory, and he never actually, nobody asked him how bronze can be dated. It can't be carbon dated. So, this is the situation today. The situation is unfortunate, and I think it is the duty of historians and those who care for the national heritage, real national heritage, to be on guard against this kind of attitude. I'll start off from this point. If you really consider architecture and sculpture, there are almost nothing before the time of Ashoka. Almost nothing that can be considered a part of art, except in the Indus civilization, which can be carbon dated to 2500 to 1800 BC. There, the great bath of Mohenjo-daro is there. I need not describe it because actually all contact with that tradition, as far as we can see, was lost later on. And anyone who is mischievous can say that after all, Mohenjo-daro belongs to Pakistan. But I am being a chauvinist here and taking India in the larger sense. So there is the great bath there, and curiously the use of gypsum mortar, which is very important for construction, but which ancient India throughout lacked. And there are those two statues, one of bronze, the dancing girl, famous one, although one doesn't know that it's really a statue of a dancing girl, but that's what John Marshall called it. And the other is the statue of what is called priest king. He may be a Mesopotamian merchant for all that we know, because his beard is in the Mesopotamian fashion. So it has been argued that it's of Mesopotamian influence. But apart from this, let us remember that India lacks any important architectural monument or sculpture until we come to Ashoka. That is 270 to 235 BC, roughly. Now here what is important is, I think two things. First, Iranian and Greek influence. It's obvious that Mauryan art is deeply influenced by both Iranian and Greek. Indus Basin or Pakistan had been under Iranian control from around 500 BC to 350 BC. And then, of course, Alexander's invasion in 320s BC and the subsequent occupation of areas in which the dominant communities were Iranian and Greek speaking. We must remember that Ashoka has inscriptions in both Aramaic and Greek. Aramaic inscriptions are found in Afghanistan as well as Taxila of his, and Greek around Kandahar. So this obviously establishes a very strong Iranian and Greek influence behind that spurt of activity. But this does not deprive Ashoka of something for which he has not fully been given credit. See, he was a pioneer. And for a pioneer to show such grace, such taste of grace, such good taste in both sculpture and architecture is amazing. You have before you the Vaishali pillar. This is one of the most which is an ordinary pillars of Ashoka. But since this also contains the lion at the top, this I have chosen to show. You know, the whole pillar is plain, the body of the pillar, with Mauryan polish, which unfortunately we have not been able to discover how this was done, how the stone was treated. Whether it was taken from Chunar near Banaras and Mirzapur or Babhosa near Kausambi itself near Allahabad is a matter of dispute. But stone was taken from there and it was cut probably at the site and then polished, and then there is the capital at the top. Now this kind of balance, view of balance, is very rare in early measures, early uses of a new art. Then the sculptured part of it, no human beings are shown, were actually shown in Mauryan art. They were only animals, but the realism of in the depiction of the animals, well, this is the Sarnath capital. Then with Ashoka also begins rock cut architecture. And although he was a Buddhist, there are 3 other caves in Barawar Hill. These he dedicated to the Ajivikas, although the Buddhists believe that the Ajivika leader, contemporary leader, wanted to murder Gautama Buddha. But Ashoka in one of his inscriptions says that he came there and dedicated one of the caves to the Ajivikas. The other 2 are also dedicated to the Ajivikas. So, both unfortunately, very fortunately tolerance and very unfortunately intolerance are parts of our history. So that's also a part of our national heritage, the deletion of the word of the name of Ajivikas. There's another cave of Mauryan times with which Ashoka has nothing to do, Ramgarh caves in central India. And that is very important because not only does it contain that cave is not here. Not only does it contain a very ancient Brahmi inscription in Ashoka's language and Ashokan dialect. It has no Ra. Varanasi is Valanasi, but it's a romantic inscription. It gives someone pleasure that one of the earliest inscriptions, in India, should be such a romantic inscription. It addressed by an artist of Banaras who, if you see his paintings in the cave, was a very ordinary one, but he was in love with Sutanata, the Devdasi. This is the first indication that there were Devdasis or temple women in that period. And he declares his love for him. So clearly, even romance goes back to the Ashokan period, although one can't attribute it to Ashoka, poor fellow. These things, I think, are important. They're not, fortunately, in many of our textbooks, they escape attention. I have not found many textbooks in which, for instance, it is shown how word Ajivaka, name Ajivaka was deleted, or even a reference to this inscription by an impecunious Varanasi artist. The history of sculpture of human forms begins immediately after Ashoka. Bharut and then Sanchi are instances. Our great show remains of that art. This is entirely Buddhist. The sculptures are those of Jataka stories. I suppose you know Jataka stories are about. In fact, the ancient origins of the Jataka stories are proved by Bharut and Sanchi, because Bharut is 2nd century BC. And the artists not only showed scenes from the Jataka stories, but also wrote down what they were showing. These are labeled, each sculpture has a label inscription, which is very rare otherwise in ancient India. This also brings to the fact that to the forefront the fact that sculpture began as a Buddhist enterprise, not as Brahmanical. In fact, there is no Brahmanical deity shown until, first of all, on Greek coinage and Kushan coinage of 1st century and 1st century BC and 1st century and 2nd century AD. Entire sculpture is Buddhist, whether Bharat, Sanchi, Gandhara art, or much of Mathura, early Mathura art, where there is a Jain stupa also and Jain sculpture, in addition to Buddhist sculpture. Also Amravati in the Deccan. All these are Buddhist sites, and the first phase of Indian sculpture is therefore entirely Buddhist. But clearly the inspiration for showing scenes of action come from Iran and Greece. There was no earlier Indian tradition. The narrative sculpture is present in Iran and in Greek art. And in Gandhara art, which is again Buddhist, totally Buddhist, you can see the Hellenistic or Greco-Roman influence very, very clearly. Sometimes it seems as if Gandhara art is just Buddhist sculptures made according to the Hellenistic tradition. As V. A. Smith pointed out long ago in the history of art in India, that Indian sculpture and Indian art is not to be regarded as part of one tradition, the Hindu tradition. It began as a Buddhist, mainly Buddhist enterprise. And many of its conventions then were adopted by Brahmanical sculptors. I now turn to architecture. As far as ordinary houses were concerned, everyone now agrees that in Mauryan times they were either mud-walled or made of wood. Early texts, like the early portion of Milinda Panho, makes it quite clear. In Taxila, near the hills, stone was used. But Taxila has not up till yet revealed any large building, even Taxila, structural building. According to eyewitnesses like Fa Yan, Sung Yun, and Yuan Chuang from around 400 AD to 640 AD, Kanishka built a tall vihara at Peshawar. This has now been, its remains have been discovered, and the casket also, the main casket, golden casket. And there also is a very characteristic Indian element in it. The casket is a forged one. Kanishka was asked to pay for gold, and what we have now found is that it was copper gilded. So this too is a very old and ancient tradition of which Indians should be proud. Anyway, this is again one of the interesting bits you pick up when you read dull books like Sten Corno's volume on Kharoshti inscriptions. There were, however, attempts to build brick and stone structures. And there were also attempts to use lime mortar. I won't go into details, but lime mortar has been used in Vidisha or Besnagar, although very weak, almost 14% of what it should have been. So it could not actually have really bonded bricks. At Bhitargaon, there is the brick temple of 5th century AD near Kanpur. The whole thing is based on the Trebiat principle. You lay brick on brick, and then you make the bricks lean until they meet at the top, and that's called Trebiat architecture. But Cunningham, who wrote on it first, discovered that there was a true arch there in it. You can't see it, unfortunately, in this. But there was a true arch. That is to say, a true arch means that you don't put stones or bricks on one after on another and then make them lean like this till they meet. But you have a curve, and where each piece does not fall down because its width at the higher point is greater than at the lower point, so it can't slip in. And then there is a keystone which throws the weight down so that the true arch stands. Now that's known as arcuate construction. So this was the first instance of the arcuate construction, but unfortunately the bricks in the arch were too long, to really be strong enough. Now, in Bhitargaon, they are made longer and they meet at the longer sides. At the end, the longer ends meet each other, and so they are weak. But the basic principle is there. But nothing came out of it. So and there is no mortar, lime mortar used. Without lime mortar or bonding cement, true arches, arcuate construction is difficult to sustain. At least in the beginning, they should be bonded together. So why lime and gypsum, although gypsum was used in the Indus civilization, is totally absent in ancient India, and why arcuate construction did not then develop after Bhitargaon are mysteries. Now, because perhaps of this technological failure, Indian architecture developed in two different forms. And basically, we are concerned with the temples because they are the only form in which structures have survived. One was cave architecture that continued to develop, and here I mention Ellora. I mean, Ajanta is also an example, but Ellora is a fantastic example of cave architecture, particularly the Shiv temple. And the sculpture, outstanding sculpture. But the Shiv temple, for instance, known as the Kailash temple, is in its planning and in its construction is really a great achievement, because the stone cutters started from the top. They had a full plan. They first cut the rock to make the shikhar, and then they came down, and everything to the detail is cut on bed scissors exactly in the same way, exactly the same measurements. This is a fantastic achievement.